Yesterday.
Just then.
Meanwhile.
12 seconds later. A few seconds later.
A little longer than a few seconds later. Many seconds later. Many seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later.
12 minutes later.
15 minutes later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Many minutes later. Many minutes later.
1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
4 hours later. 5 hours later. 6 hours later.
6.5 hours later.
7 hours later. 8 hours later. 9 hours later.
9.25 hours later.
Approximately 10 hours later. 10 hours later.
Approximately 24 hours later. Tomorrow for sure.
The next morning. 2 days later. 3 days later. 4 to 6 days later.
Several days later.
1 week later. 2 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
1 month later. Over 1 month later.
Several months later.
Many months later.
1 year later.
A few years later.
75 years later.
1,000 years later. 2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
4,000 years later.
2,000 centuries later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
1 eternity later.